Hey everyone, tonight's topic is a bit less philosophical and a lot more greasy. We're diving into the world of medieval snacks. Yes, even in an age without fast food joints, vending machines or hot dog stands, people still managed to find ways to indulge. Some of it was tasty, some frankly questionable, but all of it unmistakably medieval. Before we begin, feel free to like the video and subscribe, only if you actually enjoy the content here. And drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always interesting to see where everyone's tuning in around the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that low ambient hum, and let's ease into tonight's topic. In an era where most snacks looked suspicious and tasted worse, apple fritters stood out as a win. Sweet, hot, and just the right amount of risky, like most medieval choices. These golden discs were the closest thing to a donut, just without frosting or, well, food safety. So what went into a fritter? Apples, of course, but not the shiny supermarket ones we know today. Think small, tart, lumpy fruit growing wild behind the alehouse or borrowed from a neighbor's tree. These were chopped, tossed into a simple batter of flour, eggs, and often ale, since drinking water was risky, and ale made everything a bit more cheerful. Then came the frying. Deep frying in the 1300s was dramatic. The oil, usually pig, fat, was reused to the point of developing its own character. Flavor might be a stretch, but the outcome was crispy, hot, and surprisingly addictive. A fresh fritter was a genuine delight. Crunchy edges, soft center, and the ever-present threat of a third-degree burn. If you were wealthy, a dusting of imported sugar was a status symbol. For everyone else, honey or a spiced syrup worked just fine. Either way, they were sweet enough to make you forget your diet, mostly consisted of cabbage pretending to be other foods. Fritters were true street food, snagged at fairs, after church, or on market days when you wanted a snack and didn't care about getting grease on your tunic. Kids loved them, adults too, even birds tried to steal them. They were fun, fast, and indulgent enough to make you forget the pickled turnips waiting at home. Sure, sometimes they were overcooked, or the apples too sour, or the batter oddly chewy, but when they were good, they were very good. One bite, and suddenly the hardships of medieval life made just a little more sense. If fritters were the medieval donut, then cheese curds were the popcorn, bite-sized, a little squeaky, and wildly inconsistent. They weren't fancy. They didn't melt. They didn't stretch. Honestly, they didn't do much, and that was their charm. Medieval cheese wasn't crafted for aesthetics. It was made quickly, eaten quicker, and expected to survive travel, sketchy storage, and the occasional trampling by livestock. Cheese. Curds were the early-stage byproduct of cheesemaking, those fresh clumps formed before the wheel hardened into a dairy brick. To make them, milk was split into curds and whey using rennet, an enzyme from the stomach lining of a young animal. Not glamorous but effective. The curds were lightly pressed, salted and done, sometimes soft, sometimes rubbery, sometimes squeaky. They were oddly satisfying and incredibly portable. In a world where snack usually meant old bread or cold broth, cheese curds were a small victory. Monks loved them, travelers packed them, kids ate them like treats, assuming the cows had cooperated that week. You could fry them, toss them over stews, or eat them straight, hoping no one noticed you smelled like a barn. They weren't reserved for feasts or saints' days. They were everyday food, comforting, predictable, the culinary equivalent of a loyal friend, always around, never flashy but oddly reliable. Did they sometimes taste a little off? Sure. But without refrigeration, expectations adjusted. Add salt and optimism, and most people didn't complain. No, cheese curds weren't showstoppers, but they were hearty, accessible, and just indulgent enough to count as a treat. Also effective bribes for kids and cats. Let's be clear, turnips are not dessert. But in medieval times, when sugar was costly, apples weren't always around. And creativity was born of necessity. Someone looked at a turnip and thought, what if? This was pie, and thus turnip pie was born. To be fair, it wasn't always awful. Sometimes it was even decent. Think mashed turnips, hopefully tender, mixed with a bit of egg, perhaps honey or dried fruit if the cook was feeling generous. Baked inside a sturdy crust made of flour, water, and determination. The result? Occasionally edible. At its best, it was warm, mildly sweet, and gave off a vaguely comforting pudding with root vegetable feel. At worst, it tasted like livestock feed in disguise. Turnip pies stuck around for two reasons. Turnips were cheap, and pie crust could mask a lot of kitchen sins. Overripe, undercooked, bitter, bake it in a crust, add a little sweetness, and it became peasant food with ambition. Was it cheesecake? No. But it tried, and in medieval Europe effort counted. You'd find these pies at fairs, on feast tables, and in monasteries where monks had too many turnips and too much time. Spices showed up too, nutmeg if the abbey was wealthy, pepper if the cook was unpredictable. Sometimes raisins made it in, just to confuse everyone. Nobles rarely ate turnip pie unless they were trying to relate to the masses or slumming it for sport, but for everyone else, it was dessert. Sort of. More like an after-dinner experiment in pastry form. Still, despite its dubious concept, it endured. People liked it, or at least didn't dislike it enough to stop. It was cheap. It was filling. It was slightly sweet. And by medieval standards, that made it a culinary triumph. Now, if there was a true comfort food hero in the medieval world, it was the meat pasty. A handheld pie filled with seasoned meat, folded in pastry and baked until golden, or lightly scorched. Think of it as the medieval version of a hot pocket, but with fewer microwaves and more existential risk. The magic of the pasty was its portability. You could eat it on the road, in the fields, or while watching a public execution. Whatever the day called for, the thick crust kept the filling warm and safe from dirt, rats, and sneezes. As for the filling, meat was flexible. If you lived near a manor, you might get pork, mutton, or venison. Otherwise, the menu got creative. Rabbit, pigeon, eel, even hedgehog. If it had legs or slithered, it could be diced and seasoned into something almost savory. Spices helped mask issues, pepper, sage, garlic, they improved the odds. Still, sometimes the meat had aged more than you'd like. But compared to the usual lunch of bread and onions, a meat pasty was a luxury. Vegetarian versions existed too, with cheese, leeks, or root veggies, for fasting days or the deeply devout. But let's be honest, the meat ones stole the show. Greasy, hot and satisfying, you didn't ask too many questions. You just ate and hoped. People even marked the crusts with initials or symbols to avoid mix-ups, especially miners and laborers. In some regions the crust was thicker on one edge, so dirty hands could hold it and then toss it to the rats or spirits. Were they good? Often, yes. Were they a mystery? Always. But that was the fun. You didn't eat a meat pasty for certainty. You ate it because it was tasty and you were willing to deal with the consequences. Finally, let's talk breath mints, medieval style. In a world where dental care meant rinsing with wine and hoping, candied fennel seeds were the closest thing to fresh breath. Tiny, sugary and herbal, they were part treat, part digestion aid and part hazard to your teeth. These seeds were coated in a hard sugar shell, which, in the Middle Ages, was no small achievement. Sugar had to be imported, boiled, and beaten, candied. Fennel seeds were more than just a treat. They were a belief. Someone, somewhere, genuinely trusted in the potential of these tiny, hand-coated snacks. They were especially popular in aristocratic households, where guests might receive a small dish of them after dinner, meant to freshen the breath and perhaps distract from the lingering flavor of roast meat. Flavor-wise, fennel had a bold licorice note. You either enjoyed it or discreetly swallowed it and offered a polite nod. The sugar coating helped, but it couldn't fully mask that sharp, herbal punch, one that made you feel both sophisticated and slightly uncertain. But these seeds weren't just for flavor, they served a purpose. Fennel was believed to help digestion, especially after a rich meal that might involve multiple birds and too much mead. Think of them as the medieval blend of chewing gum and antacid, though one with real tooth-chipping potential. Yes, they were that hard. You didn't just chew them carelessly. First you tested one, bit down gently, listened for any signs of danger, then proceeded. It was always a calculated risk. While the wealthy enjoyed them like medieval breath mints, the lower classes sometimes accessed cheaper versions. These imitations were often made with honey, crushed herbs, and a dash of hope. Not the same, but passable enough to pretend. In the world of medieval snack food, candied fennel seeds were tiny but memorable. They didn't fill your stomach, but they left a lingering taste and gave the illusion of refinement, even if you were still muddy and covered in goose grease. If medieval desserts had a star, it was the honey cake, sweet, dense, and known to stick to everything except expectations. These were the results of bold baking in a time when sugar was rare and locked away like treasure. Honey was the everyday sweetener. For those who had bees, access to bees, or didn't mind getting stung while climbing trees, these cakes were typically made with flour, water, and generous dollops of honey, or what counted as a dollop, in a time when spoons were more. Structurally, these cakes weren't delicate. Many resembled bricks, and slicing required a strong knife and the hope no one was watching you struggle. Eating was simpler, though a soft bite wasn't guaranteed. These were cakes built for tough lives, firm, sticky, and coated in enough honey to make you feel like you'd wrestled a beehive. Still, they were satisfying, warm, indulgent, and a break from salted barley or chasing rodents from your pantry. They were joy in edible form, just chewy enough to double as cardio. Fried fish skin cracklings were perhaps the most unexpectedly delightful snack from a culture that also believed eel pie was a solid choice. These crispy, salty pieces weren't luxurious, but they were efficient. In an age of frugality, no part of a fish went to waste, especially when it smelled like it had an opinion of its own. No one deliberately invented this snack. More likely, a practical cook stared at a pile of leftover fish skin and thought, why not fry it? One splash of hot fat later, and something new, if not quite revolutionary, was born. In coastal towns or riverside communities, fish skin was plentiful. The meat went to stews, the heads to cats, and the skins straight into sizzling oil. The result? A crisp, addictive snack that crackled like dried leaves, but delivered a bold ocean flavor. Add a sprinkle of salt, and it was better. Toss in garlic, or herbs, and you bordered on culinary greatness. These weren't just tasty, they were useful, lightweight, non-perishable, or close enough, and packed with fat. They fueled tired bodies after long days of chopping wood or defending livestock. Soldiers packed them, sailors lived on them, and peasants sold them outside taverns, satisfying patrons louder than the bar brawl inside. Yes, sometimes they still had scales. Yes, some curled into strange shapes, but by the standards of the day, they were refined, crunchy, flavorful, and unlikely to cause dysentery. The only downside? The smell. One batch could announce itself. From 3 huts away, fry them indoors, and your home smelled like Neptune's laundry for a week, but no one blamed you. They tasted that good. When faced with stale bread and lukewarm ale, people didn't complain, they improvised. Enter the most resourceful medieval snack, bread soaked in ale. Also called soups or trench toast, this was comfort food at its most. Basic, imagine French toast stripped of eggs, sugar, and charm. Here's how it worked. Take yesterday's bread, the kind firm enough to use in construction, and dunk it into ale. Not today's boutique ale with citrus notes and a floral finish, but flat, low-alcohol brew made in a smoky room with barn-level hygiene. The bread soaked it up like a sponge, suspicious of its surroundings. It softened, puffed up, and morphed into something almost edible. Was it delicious? In the right mood, under forgiving lighting? Sure. It was warm, doughy, and mildly bitter. And from the fermented grain. In other words, it didn't offend. Popular with the working class, this snack required no cutlery or multiple courses, just something to fill the stomach quickly. Sometimes people added herbs, a bit of cheese, or a fried egg if the hen was feeling productive. On feast days, ale was spiced, and the dish became something special. It stretched ingredients too. Stale bread, soak it. Turning ale, pour it on. Waste was a luxury they couldn't afford. The catch? It didn't travel. Once soaked, it became a soggy, sloshy cube. Eat it fast or end up with medieval mush, and a metaphor for lost hope. Still, on a cold evening, a bowl of ale-bread mush and a bit of peace went a long way. If you've ever looked at a slice of bread and thought, this would be better in wine, you'd have fit in well with the medieval upper class. Sops in. Wine were one of the more curious desserts of the era, technically a sweet or maybe just a soggy indulgence. The method was simple. Take a piece of bread, preferably toasted or at least not rock hard, and dip it in wine. Not just any wine, though usually it was warm, sweetened, or spiced. Something fragrant enough to distract from the fact it had aged in a clay jug since the last harvest. Once soaked, the bread was served soft and spoonable. Nobles called it refined. Others quietly suspected. The cook was improvising. This wasn't finger food. It was a dish meant for slow spoonfuls, likely while lute music played in the background at a banquet, or awkward dinner where politics were off limits and soggy toast passed as conversation. Filler. Done right, sops in wine were comforting, rich from the wine, textured from the bread, and enhanced by spices that added a sense of occasion. Done wrong, they were just soggy bread in a bowl. No amount of cinnamon could fix that. Occasionally, dried fruits or nuts were added for flair. Sometimes that was enough to elevate the dish. Sometimes it was just wet toast with accessories. Sometimes cheese. Occasionally, a whole egg. At that point, it stopped being a snack and started feeling more like a culinary guessing game. Peasants made their own versions, usually substituting cheap vinegar or ale for wine. It wasn't quite dessert, nor exactly dinner or breakfast. It was whatever passed as a meal that left you both full and slightly puzzled. Still, soaked bread and wine endured. They were warm, filling, and gave medieval people a brief sense of luxury, even if the result resembled a sponge soaked in mold and regret. In the Middle Ages, dried fruit was a coveted treat, sweet, exotic, and durable enough to survive an entire crusade. But let's be clear, this wasn't today's neatly packed trail mix. Medieval dried fruit had a single goal: long shelf life. Flavor was optional. Texture, aggressively chewy. Damaging your teeth was just part of the deal. Let's cover the basics. You had the usual options: raisins, figs, dates, and if you had the means, imported prunes. These fruits were sun-dried, smoke-dried, or occasionally just abandoned on a windowsill until they officially lost all moisture. Wrinkled, tough, and unnervingly dense. Think of them as edible relics from last harvest. The benefit: dried fruit was intensely sweet. Concentrated sugars turned these shriveled bites into medieval candy. Nobles loved them. Monks guarded them. Children considered them rare treasure from the pantry. The downside? Chewing them felt like arm wrestling your own jaw. Figs had seeds that doubled as rustic dental floss. Dates were sticky enough to glue your molars together. Raisins clung to your teeth like they had a personal vendetta. Silent snacking was impossible. Still, dried fruit had its uses, baked into pies, stirred into porridge, or chopped into honey cakes to fake variety. The wealthy wrapped them in pastry, drizzled them with rosewater, or soaked them in wine to impress guests from Florence. For common folk, getting dried fruit was a special event. usually a holiday, a wedding, or that one time a year someone remembered you existed. When that moment came, you ate it slowly, respectfully, possibly hiding in a barn so you didn't have to share. Storage was simple. Dried fruit didn't spoil easily and was kept in cloth bags or clay pots. Over time, it hardened, which made it last longer, or double as a projectile if you had siblings and imagination. In short, dried fruit was sweet, luxurious, and just slightly hazardous. It stayed with you, sometimes literally. When hunger struck and you wanted something hot, heavy, and borderline aggressive, you turned to the blood pudding ball. This medieval snack was dense, bold, and unapologetically rich in iron, making today's sausage rolls look like diet food, born from the practical need to use every part of the animal. These savory spheres proved the motto: waste not, want not, even if what you weren't wasting was blood. Here's how it worked. Collect fresh animal blood, usually pig, though any kind would do in a pinch. Mix it with oats, onions, suet, that's beef fat, and spices. Once the mixture reached the perfect level of sticky dread, shape it into balls and fry them in hot fat until the outside turned crispy and defiant. The result? Dark, crisp orbs packed with protein and a flavor best described as earthy, which really means you'll taste iron and uncertainty for the rest of the day. They were best eaten hot from the skillet, though cold versions weren't uncommon, especially if you were hungry. Enough to overlook the congealed fat. Nobles added pepper, served them with eggs or ale. Peasants were just glad it wasn't boiled cabbage. Blood pudding balls weren't fancy, but they were effective, portable, calorie-dense, and incredibly filling. 2 and you could skip lunch. 4 and you were either a blacksmith or losing a bet. You'd find them at fairs, markets, and roadside stalls, places that smelled like livestock and ambition. They were particularly popular in winter, because what better way to warm your soul than with something fried and coagulated? Of course, not everyone loved them. Some disliked the texture, others the concept. But in a world where survival was the priority and taste came somewhere near 12th. These meaty bites earned their spot in the medieval snack canon. Forget modern pancakes with syrup and whipped cream. Medieval pancakes were thinner, tougher, and fried in enough lard to make your arteries second-guess their choices, but they did the job. And compared to the alternative, thin soup with an existential crisis, they were practically indulgent. Made from a basic batter of flour, eggs, and water or ale, these pancakes were ladled onto an iron griddle coated in hot pig fat. No non-stick pans, no portion control, just pour and hope. The outcome? A flat, uneven circle with crispy edges and a chewy center, the kind of pancake that could survive a journey on horseback and still be mostly edible upon arrival. Sometimes they were burnt, sometimes raw, sometimes somehow both. Flavor depended on what was available. A splash of ale for tang, a spoon of honey for richness, a pinch of herbs, or somewhere between snack and sacrament was the medieval wafer, a light, crisp biscuit that balanced delicately between dessert and dental hazard. Wafers were everywhere, outside churches, at fairs, in monks' hands, and occasionally floating in soup like a sacred crouton. Not to be confused with modern cream-filled treats, these were made with flour, water, eggs, and little else. Fancy versions included honey or rosewater, but most were strictly functional. The batter was poured into hot metal wafer irons pressed between 2 sizzling plates. Think of a medieval panini press. The result looked holy and tasted like crispy ambition. Wafers were a hit because they were quick to make, easy to carry, and profitable. Vendors lined church exits on feast days, waving stacks of warm wafers at parishioners. "Buy now, sin later" wasn't the slogan, but it captured the mood. They were often pressed with religious symbols, floral motifs, or a vague, saintly face, depending on the mold and how tired the baker was. These designs didn't enhance flavor, but gave you something to stare at, while chewing and pretending you weren't underwhelmed. Structurally, wafers were fragile. They cracked if you looked at them wrong and shattered if you tried to break them. Cleanly, transporting them was a logistical gamble involving crumbs, wind, and regret. Still, they were loved, light, crisp, and a little festive. Wafers were the medieval version of a treat-yourself moment that didn't ruin your digestion or your budget. Nobles ate them with fruit or cheese. Everyone else bought them by the dozen and ate them immediately, before they turned into edible. Dust, and finally, suck it. Even the name sounds sticky. This medieval delicacy was fruit boiled into surrender, soaked in syrup, and sealed in jars like sweet prisoners. Think candied oranges, dates, or ginger, drenched in sugar until your teeth tingled and your conscience whispered, you probably shouldn't, but you did. Because it tasted good, was likely imported, and you had nothing better. Suck it wasn't for the average peasant stuck on his 7th onion of the week. This was elite snacking, served in noble halls or gifted by the wealthy as a high-end gesture. Of affection that didn't involve land, sugar was expensive, fresh fruit wasn't always available. So suck it was reserved for special days, weddings, royal visits, or Wednesdays if you were extravagantly rich and lacked impulse control. The process was elaborate. First, the fruit was boiled in syrup, maybe honey, maybe refined sugar if you had the right connections. Then it was drained, dried a bit, and boiled again, repeatedly, because once wasn't enough. You weren't just preserving fruit, you were waging war on moisture. Eventually you got a glossy, jewel-toned piece of candy, chewy, intense, and slightly alarming. Some variations were so sweet they might as well have been classified as a controlled substance. Some types were soft and syrupy, served in decorative glass jars. Others were dry, dusted with sugar, and presented as tiny cubes, like medieval candy with a vengeance. But make no mistake, suck it was a luxury. Owning it meant you had access to the sugar trade and probably a servant whose sole task was to stir things that resisted stirring. Suck-it trays were passed around at feasts like edible gold coins. Guests would take one, smile politely, and instantly regret not grabbing more. Commoners, meanwhile, watched from the kitchens, maybe sneaking a taste off a spoon if no one noticed. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Suck-it was one of the rare medieval treats that truly felt like dessert, rich, sophisticated, and just indulgent enough to make up for a dinner of something boiled. Enter fried eel, the grand finale of medieval snack. Food, oddly adored, it transitioned from the hearths of peasants to royal banquets without ever stopping to ask, am I really the best option here? Apparently, yes. Eel was abundant across Europe's rivers and streams, easy to catch, cheap to cook, and surprisingly crispy when fried. Raw, they were slippery, unexpectedly bony, and shaped like something from a horror story. But people still ate them in massive quantities. Why? Because they tasted good, and more importantly, they weren't turnips. To prepare them, you'd catch them at night, when they moved like sentient noodles through shallow waters. Skinning them was less like cleaning fish, and more like wrestling a rope that refused to give up. Once cleaned, they'd be chopped, seasoned if you were feeling adventurous, and dropped into hot fat until the skin crisped and the meat turned firm and palatable. The result, a savory, crunchy bite with a rich, slightly oily flavor, like calamari. And chicken having a culinary identity crisis in a tavern. Fried eel was served at fairs, inns, feasts, and, oddly enough, during religious fasts. That's right. Eel wasn't classified as meat, so it slid through fasting rules just like it slid through water. Monks ate it, nobles flaunted it, and kings had it baked into pies and displayed at feasts like the aquatic serpent it aspired to. Sure, it had bones, lots of them, and yes, it sometimes twitched after death, but if you could get past that and ignore the feeling that you were eating a fairy tale villain, it was genuinely good. crispy skin, tender inside, and just greasy enough to feel like a rebellious choice for a Wednesday. It may seem strange now, but back then it was a delicacy, a curious little miracle that kept stomachs full and menus imaginative. In ancient Mesopotamia, mystery and myth intertwined, and nowhere more so than in their understanding of dreams. To the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, dreams weren't just random nighttime thoughts. They were divine messages, cosmic emails sent directly from the gods. Ignoring them was like leaving a message from Enlil on red, a risky move. By 2500 BCE, they'd established a full-fledged system of dream interpretation written on clay, tablets in cuneiform. These records weren't bedtime curiosities. They guided decisions in politics, medicine, and religious life. Kings postponed wars if a dream carried bad omens. Farmers avoided planting if they dreamed of flying goats. They believed the world constantly spoke. It was up to humans to listen with closed eyes. Trained specialists known as Baru priests served as dream analysts, long before Freud came along, just without the couch. They studied extensive omen texts, like the Ishkar Zakuku, a dream manual classifying dreams and their outcomes, sometimes bizarre but oddly specific. Eating dates in a dream? Good omen. Teeth falling out? Expect death in the family? Dream of intimacy with a goddess? You're either blessed or dangerously arrogant. These manuals didn't speculate, they stated. Dreams followed a cause and effect pattern, like divine equations. See a snake? Betrayal's coming. Fall off a roof? Lawsuit ahead. The logic was divine, not human, but no less structured. Mesopotamians also practiced dream incubation. If a ruler needed divine guidance, he might sleep in a temple after purification rituals, fasting, incense, cleansing, all to invite a meaningful dream. They believed specific conditions made divine communication clearer and less likely to involve intoxicated goats. To them, the dream realm wasn't just mysterious, it was a domain to approach with care, reverence, and a very large dream manual. The gods were always speaking. You just had to be asleep to hear them. In ancient Egypt, dreams weren't just nightly phenomena, they were sacred messages in motion. Egyptians believed dreams came from gods, ancestors, or one's ka, the spiritual double. Each dream, whether comforting or terrifying, was sent with purpose to warn, guide, bless, or instruct. By the New Kingdom, 1550–1070 BCE, Egyptians had begun compiling dream interpretations in some of the earliest known manuals. One famous example, the Ramesside Dream Book, written on papyrus and found in Deir el-Medina. This wasn't light reading, it was a divine diagnostic text listing hundreds of dreams and predicting their outcomes as favorable or dire. The reasoning wasn't always obvious. If a man dreamt of eating crocodile meat, it meant he would become a high official. Strange, perhaps, but crocodiles were linked to the god Sobek, a symbol of strength and authority. Eating one meant absorbing divine power. Promotion unlocked. Each entry began with, "If a man sees himself," followed by the dream scenario. These weren't guesses. They drew on centuries of ritual knowledge, temple records, and personal visions. Dreams were classified as good or bad in red and black ink. If yours landed in the bad column, time to light incense and call a priest. Temples dedicated to healing gods like Serket or Thoth sometimes offered dream incubation, where people slept within the sacred space, hoping for divine guidance or healing. The process involved prayer, purification, and sleeping in a controlled setting, spiritual therapy in its earliest form. Dreams influenced medicine and magic as well. Amulets were prescribed for recurring nightmares, and rituals could erase bad dreams like curses. To Egyptians, the dreaming mind wasn't idle. It was an active arena where gods, demons, and spirits conveyed hidden truths. But only a wise interpreter or a priest could make sense of them. In ancient Greece, dreams weren't just divine hints. They were diagnostic consultations with the gods. Central to this belief was incubation, a ritual in which people slept in sacred temples, hoping for healing visions. No god was more connected to this than Asclepius, the deity of medicine. Temples, called Asclepieia, existed across the Greek world, from Epidaurus to Pergamon, serving the sick, the hopeful, and the desperate. Instead of pills or potions, patients were prescribed sleep, ritualized, sacred, and spiritually prepared. Before entering the abaton, the sleeping quarters, a patient underwent purification, bathing, fasting, and sometimes animal sacrifice. Only after. Whether miraculous or psychosomatic, the effects were real. Even Hippocrates acknowledged dreams' medical significance. He believed the body could signal its state through symbolic imagery. Dreams of water might reflect kidney trouble. Being crushed might indicate chest issues. Greek texts divided dreams into two categories: natural, resulting from food, stress, or emotions, and divine, direct messages from the gods. Both were taken seriously. Not every dream interpreter wore a physician's robes, but in the ancient world, dreams were seen as a legitimate diagnostic tool, divine consultations that offered insight into health, fate, and the cosmos itself. In ancient times, the true stars of the public square were not performers or politicians, but the onerokrite, or dream readers. Armed with dream manuals, omens, and a flair for interpretation, they translated dreams into messages, warnings, blessings, or instructions. The most influential of these manuals was the Onerocritica, written by Artemidorus of Daldis in the the 2nd century CE, a work still referenced centuries later. In ancient Greece, dreams were far more than random nighttime experiences. They were bridges between the human and the divine, between body and soul, illness and healing. If you were fortunate, a dream might deliver a cure, and perhaps a snake curled at your feet as a sign of it. Across the ancient world, one type of dream held particular significance: the prophetic dream. These were not just messages, they were considered revelations, warnings, or divine instructions. In cultures from Mesopotamia and Egypt to Greece and beyond, such dreams were viewed as sacred transmissions from a higher realm, direct links to gods, fate, or the hidden workings of the cosmos. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, prophetic dreams were a legitimate and respected form of divine communication. The Old Testament includes many such instances. For example, Joseph, son of Jacob, dreamed of sheaves of wheat bowing to his own, foretelling his rise to power. Later, he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams in Egypt, predicting 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. That vision shifted Egypt's entire economic strategy. Joseph didn't just interpret dreams. He became a national advisor because of them. In Mesopotamia, kings frequently received dreams foretelling victory, disaster, or divine approval. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal claimed to see gods in his dreams, guiding his leadership in war and governance. These visions reinforced the idea that divine legitimacy was crucial for rulers, especially in societies where the line between king and god was thin. The Greeks also deeply valued prophetic dreams. They categorized them carefully. Dreams from the subconscious were called enhypnia, while those believed to reveal truth were called oneiroi alethinoi. These dreams were taken seriously. Before founding cities, going to war, or embarking on voyages, leaders often sought dream guidance or consulted trained interpreters. Dreams even had their own minor deities, the oneiroi, winged spirits believed to carry divine messages to sleeping minds. Even the typically practical Romans took prophetic dreams seriously. Emperor Augustus supposedly dreamed of his future glory, and Emperor Nero consulted dream interpreters during his reign, though perhaps not as often as he should have. The General Scipio Africanus, before defeating Hannibal, reportedly had a dream in which his ancestors foretold his victory. In these ancient societies, prophetic dreams were not fringe beliefs. They were tools of governance, instruments of power, and signs of divine selection. The destinies of empires, rulers, and nations often began with a simple vision whispered in the night. While Greek Asclepian temples are the most recognized dream incubation sites, the practice was widespread. In Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, dream healing emerged from a rich blend of Hittite, Phrygian, and later Greco-Roman traditions. Sacred spaces and temples were dedicated to fostering contact with divine forces through sleep. A particularly compelling example is the cult of Men, a Phrygian lunar god linked with healing cycles and, naturally, dreams. His temples, often located on hills under open skies, seem designed to catch lunar messages delivered into the dreams of supplicants. People struggling with illness, spiritual distress, or uncertainty would travel to these sanctuaries to practice incubation, ritual sleep, in hopes of receiving healing or guidance in their dreams. While similar to Asclepian traditions, Anatolian practices had unique features. Pilgrims sometimes walked labyrinths or slept beneath sacred carvings, believing such settings enhanced divine communication. Incense, music, and chanting were also used to attune the sleeper's mind to a divine frequency. This was not rest, it was spiritual tuning. Texts from the region mention dream priests, specialists trained to guide and interpret visions. These priests might even shape dreams by suggesting symbols or images before sleep. For example, someone hoping for insight into future children might sleep with a carved fertility idol under their pillow. If they dreamt of a lion, a priest might declare a brave son was coming. If it rained in the dream, it could signify a wise and nurturing daughter. Hittite records also speak of royal dream encounters. Kings and queens received strategic advice, healing insights, or divine instructions while asleep. One queen, for instance, was told in a dream to welcome a foreign goddess into her temple, an early case of divine diplomacy. Dream incubation in Anatolia was more than a personal journey. It was communal and cosmic. Pilgrims often formed temporary, healing communities connected not by blood, but by shared vulnerability and hope. Sleep became a ritual act, where prophecy and healing emerged not through logic, but through the silent language of dreams. By the 2nd century CE, dream interpretation had evolved into a sophisticated craft. Artemidorus of Daldis, a Greek from Asia Minor, undertook the ambitious task of systematizing the art in his 5-volume work, Oneirocritica. Unlike mystical scribes who cloaked dreams in divine mystery, Artemidorus approached the subject with scholarly discipline and psychological insight. His work was not a vague guide, but a comprehensive text written in accessible Greek, packed with thousands of dream scenarios and their interpretations. He spent decades collecting real-world dreams from all walks of life, sailors, merchants, sex workers, and soldiers, believing that to understand a culture's soul, you must listen to its dreams. He classified dreams by theme, actions, animals, professions, bodily functions, relationships. Dreaming of flying could signal freedom or arrogance. Dreaming of public nudity could mean shame or potential empowerment, depending on your social class. Losing teeth. That likely indicated a loss, often of a relative. What set Artemidorus apart was his insistence on context. Earlier dream books offered static meanings, but he believed interpretation should be tailored to the dreamer's gender, status, occupation, and circumstances. A wealthy man dreaming of a shipwreck might face financial ruin. A poor man could expect unexpected fortune. His method was an early form of personalized analysis, almost akin to modern psychotherapy. He also understood symbolism deeply. A dream about death might mean transformation. A dream involving sex might point to power dynamics or guilt, not just desire. His interpretations were at once logical and bizarre, grounded yet imaginative. The Onera Critica was no obscure volume. It was used for centuries across the Roman Empire and Byzantine world, later influencing medieval scholars and Arabic interpreters. Artemidorus turned dreams into something to study, not just for prophecy, but for insight. Whether or not he believed dreams came from the gods, he certainly believed they came from somewhere profound and worth decoding. However, not all ancient dreams were divine gifts. Some were seen as dark omens, haunting visions from restless spirits, malevolent forces, or even the underworld. These weren't brushed off as bad nights. They were treated as serious warnings or punishments. The Babylonians were among the first to distinguish between divine and malevolent dreams. If a dream caused fear, illness, or emotional distress, it was considered polluted. Priests would be summoned to perform apotropaic rituals, cleansing ceremonies, offerings, or symbolic actions to neutralize the dream's power. If someone dreamed of being chased by a demon, for instance, the remedy might include sleeping with a protective amulet or burning cedarwood incense to repel evil. The Egyptians also had developed practices to prevent nightmares. They believed some dreams were caused by malicious entities, including the dead. Protective amulets, like those bearing the eye of Horus or the image of Bez, the dwarf god who guarded households, were commonly worn. Some individuals even recited dream-erasing spells upon waking, treating nightmares like spiritual infections that needed to be purged. In ancient Greek thought, nightmares weren't simply bad dreams, they were warnings. Often they weren't from the Olympian gods, but from chthonic deities, those connected to the earth and underworld. Hades, Persephone, and even the feared Erinyes, or Furies, could appear in dreams to express divine anger or reveal unpunished crimes. Ignoring these messages came with serious risks. Philosopher Plato in the Republic described dreams as a battleground between reason and desire. For him, a nightmare wasn't only spiritual, it was psychological. It showed the soul was out of harmony. The Romans, practical as they were, also feared dream symbols. Creatures like owls, snakes, or wolves were seen as harbingers of death, betrayal, or war. They believed that the dead could visit the living through dreams, sometimes to warn, other times to accuse. Across priests and oracles supported this practice. Dream interpretation became a religious tool, especially when it aligned with the goals of rulers or elite temples. If a rebellious governor dreamed of disaster, a priest might interpret it as divine judgment for challenging imperial rule. Conversely, dreams of success and abundance, if interpreted favorably, could inspire leaders to launch campaigns, raise taxes, or introduce reforms. This wasn't limited to male rulers. Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt claimed in temple writings that her divine birth had been foretold in a dream by the god Amun, who appeared to her mother. By framing her reign as preordained, she secured her position on a male-dominated throne. Prophets in the Hebrew Bible also used dreams as instruments of influence. The prophet Daniel interpreted King Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a massive statue to symbolize the rise and fall of empires. These weren't just religious visions, they were strategic messages disguised as allegory. In every culture, dreams gave leaders a way to say, "This isn't just my will, it's the will of heaven." Whether they were divine revelations or calculated propaganda, dreams held immense political value. They turned the subconscious into a form of governance, one symbolic vision at a time. Though the temples have fallen and the dream-interpreting priests lie buried by history, their legacy lives on. Echoes of ancient dream interpretation can still be heard in psychology and science today. Much of what we believe about dreams, their symbols, repeated patterns and meanings, traces back to those early efforts to decode the sleeping mind. Medieval societies embraced these traditions. Islamic scholars translated Oneirocritica by Artemidorus into Arabic, refining its interpretations. In Islamic mysticism, dreams became deeply respected as pathways to divine insight. Meanwhile, Christian monks and theologians recorded dreams of saints and martyrs, often describing miracles or signs of divine justice. The basic belief held steady: sleep as sacred ground, dreams as veiled messages, and interpreters as mediators between human and divine. Jump to the 19th and 20th centuries, and you meet Sigmund Freud. While Freud dismissed religious explanations, his famous work, The Interpretation of Dreams, 1899, borrowed heavily from the symbolic systems built centuries earlier. He argued dreams reflected repressed desires and fears, but his approach still used metaphor, imagery, and narrative, just like the ancients. His student Carl Jung took it further. He believed the dream world was populated by universal archetypes like the shadow, the hero, and the wise old man, figures not unlike those found in ancient mythologies. Even modern neuroscience, while explaining dreams biologically, respects their psychological depth. Concepts like REM sleep, lucid dreaming, and the impact of memory or trauma on dream content mirror ancient beliefs that dreams reflected both body and soul. Pop culture keeps this fascination alive. From horror films about sleep paralysis to dream journal apps promising self-awareness, we continue to be drawn to what our dreams reveal. The old idea still lingers. What we see in sleep matters. The ancients may not have had brain scans or sleep labs, but they understood something we're still trying to figure out. Dreams aren't random. They're stories, signals, or shadows, whispered in the languages of gods, ancestors, or our own minds. And so the question endures, what is your dream trying to tell you? By the mid-19th century, the United States was stretching across a vast continent. By 1860, California had been part of the Union for a decade, but it still felt distant, more like a cousin than a sibling. The East bustled with cities, telegraphs, and railroads, while the West remained wild, remote, and painfully disconnected. A letter from New York to San Francisco could take 3 to 4 weeks, sometimes more, depending on weather, delays, or theft. And that's if it arrived at all. Mail routes were inefficient and inconsistent. The most common method involved ships carrying mail down the Atlantic, across the Isthmus of Panama, and then up the Pacific coast, a route plagued by disease, delays, and logistical chaos. The overland stagecoach route wasn't much better. It was slow, dangerous, and often blocked by mud, snow, or violence. This wasn't just frustrating, it was politically risky. The federal government worried that California, so isolated, might start to drift away in loyalty. With talk of secession already rising, national unity was no longer optional. It was a priority. That's when bold thinkers proposed dramatic solutions. One of the boldest, create a relay mail system using what the West had in abundance: open, land and fast horses. If trained riders could race across the country, switching horses every 10 to 15 miles, they could slash delivery time from weeks to just 10 days. It sounded crazy. The route from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California would stretch nearly 2,000 miles. It crossed deserts, mountains, rivers, and barely charted lands. Riders would face scorching heat, freezing nights, and constant threat of attack. But if it worked, it would become the fastest communication line between the two coasts. The problem was clear. America was growing faster than its infrastructure. So with a mix of urgency, ambition, and frontier grit, a daring solution was born. 1. Leather satchel at a time. The Pony Express was on its way. The Pony Express didn't appear out of nowhere. It was the invention of 3 businessmen from the freight and stagecoach company Russell, Majors, and Waddell, based in Missouri. William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell were already seasoned players in overland shipping, moving freight and government supplies through the untamed frontier. In 1860, they set their sights higher, reduce mail delivery time, to California. For Russell, this was personal. His reputation had taken a hit from past scandals and failed business deals. The Pony Express was a chance to restore his standing and gain favor with the federal government. If successful, it could secure a valuable mail contract. Majors was the logistical mastermind. Deeply religious and disciplined, he demanded high moral standards from employees, even requiring riders and station workers to swear off drinking. And swearing, he also built a structured system of relay stations every 10 to 15 miles, with larger home stations every 75 to 100 miles. The entire network was run like a military operation. Waddell, the quietest of the 3, handled the legal and financial planning, while Russell took on the role of public face and promoter. Together, they launched one of the most ambitious communication experiments in American history, a daring attempt to link a divided country, one galloping horse at a time. And Major, the operations mastermind, Waddell, handled the bookkeeping and kept the enterprise financially viable, at least for a time. Together, the 3 invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into their venture. They acquired over 400 horses, hired more than 80 riders, and established around 190 relay stations across some of the most isolated parts of the American frontier. They understood the risks. The route would be punishing. But they also recognized that solving the communication challenge of the time would secure their place in American history. Without any government assistance, they forged ahead and launched the service independently. It was a daring initiative, financially risky, logistically daunting, yet deeply emblematic of American determination. By April 1860, the Pony Express was ready to begin. The race against both geography and time had officially started. Creating the route was like stretching a fragile lifeline across a continent, without a safety net and little room for mistakes. The full route spanned nearly 2,000 miles, beginning in St. Joseph, Missouri, and ending in Sacramento, California. It cut through a wide variety of terrains, plains, mountain ranges, deserts, and treacherous rivers. To make the system function, they constructed nearly 190 relay stations, spaced 10 to 15 miles apart, the average distance a horse could run, at full speed before tiring. Every 75 to 100 miles, larger home stations offered food, rest, and shelter for the riders. It was there that they would eat, sleep, and hand off the mail to another rider. The real backbone of the Express, however, was its horses, over 400 in total. They were not selected for appearance or size, but for speed and endurance. In the east, fast-moving thoroughbreds raced across the plains, while in the rugged west, sturdy Mustangs navigated mountainous terrain and arid deserts. These horses were the high-performance machines of the frontier. Riders galloped at full speed, dismounted mid-run, and vaulted onto fresh horses in mere seconds. Each station had to be staffed, supplied, and protected. Some stations were nothing more than basic huts. Others were fortified outposts with fencing and armed station keepers. Everything, water, feed, food, had to be transported in advance. It required months of preparation, often in harsh and unwelcoming territory. The weather was a constant threat. Riders faced snow in the Sierra Nevada, sandstorms in Utah, and sweltering heat on the Nebraska plains. Wild animals, flooding rivers, and unstable paths were daily dangers. So too were human threats, outlaws, thieves, and increasing conflict with Native American tribes. Yet despite these obstacles, the system worked. With riders changing every 75 to 100 miles and horses swapped every 10 to 15, mail crossed the country in as little as 10 days, an astonishing speed at the time. It was a logistical breakthrough powered by resilience, endurance, and an unshakable will. In a land where distance meant isolation, the Pony Express connected the coasts one gallop at a time. On April 3, 1860, the Pony Express made its official launch in Essie. The crowd erupted in cheers, cannons boomed, and a bold new era in American communication began. Fry's mailbag weighed around 20 pounds, filled with letters, telegrams, and newspapers headed for California. A telegraph message had already been sent from Washington, D.C., and would now complete its journey on horseback, symbolizing the blend of modern technology and sheer human effort. At the same time, a second rider departed from Sacramento, beginning the eastward journey. Between the two riders lay 2,000 miles of wilderness, 190 relay stations, and some of the continent's most unforgiving terrain, all to be crossed in just 10 days. Each rider carried the mochila from one station to the next, leaping from horse to horse in under 2 minutes. Ingeniously designed, the mochila had 4 locked compartments and could be quickly slipped onto the saddle without straps. Speed was everything. Riders were expected to maintain a pace of 10 miles per hour, rain, snow, night, or day, across all types of terrain. Despite the dangers, that first mail run succeeded. The letters from Missouri arrived in Sacramento in just 9 days and 23 hours. A triumph. Newspapers celebrated the feat as a marvel of modern communication, and the Pony Express became an instant legend. Though only a handful of letters were carried on that inaugural trip, the symbolism was enormous. It wasn't just about mail. It was about proving that this vast, wild land could be united and that human grit could overcome geographic isolation. For the riders, it marked the start of a perilous yet exhilarating journey. For the nation, it offered a glimpse of something revolutionary, near instant communication. The West suddenly felt a bit closer. But the true heartbeat of the Pony Express wasn't its horses or stations. It was the riders. These were brave, wiry young men who defied nature, violence, and fatigue to carry the mail across a continent. They weren't merely messengers, they were legends in the making. Most were no older than 18, many just 16. They had to be lightweight, typically, under 125 pounds, to avoid overburdening the horses. Speed and stamina were essential. The now famous recruitment ad allegedly read, "Wanted, young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18, must be expert riders willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred." Though its authenticity is debated, the message reflects the real demands of the job. Riders covered 75 to 100 miles per shift, changing horses at every relay station, pushing forward without rest until the mochila was passed on. They often rode through harsh weather, storms, snow, or blistering heat. Armed with revolvers and rifles, most still relied more on speed than firepower. Many traveled alone, unarmed, depending solely on their ability to outrun danger. Some became folk heroes. Pony Bob Haslam once rode 380 miles in under 2 days to deliver mail during a violent Paiute uprising, despite being wounded. Buffalo Bill Cody also claimed to have ridden for the Express at age 15, though historians debate that claim. But the real stories needed no embellishment. Riders crossed mountain ranges, deserts, and deadly terrain where a single mistake could be fatal. Still, the Express maintained an impressive success rate. Only one mailbag was ever lost. Despite the constant danger, many riders loved the job. They were well paid, earning $100 to $150 a month, a fortune for teenagers at the time, and they thrived on the thrill, the speed, and the sense of mission. They weren't just delivering mail, they were binding a nation together. They were emblems of endurance, bravery, and determination, charging into history with every gallop. For 18 unforgettable months, they proved that no frontier was too vast to conquer. Riding for the Pony Express wasn't just employment, it was a daily contest with death. The young riders endured hardships that would have turned most adults back, yet they pressed forward through snowstorms, flash floods, and arid deserts, across a landscape that often seemed determined to claim them. Nature posed a constant threat. They faced freezing conditions in the Sierra Nevada, blazing temperatures in Nevada's desert, and storms that turned trails to mud. A fall in the cold could lead to hypothermia. A misstep in a river could mean drowning. Many came dangerously close. Wild animals were another hazard. Wolves chased riders, rattlesnakes lay hidden along the trails, and mountain lions prowled the high passes. Yet even greater dangers came from people. Bandits and bushwhackers targeted riders, knowing their pouches sometimes carried gold dust or valuable money orders. Though armed, the riders were usually outnumbered, and stopping meant risking their mission and lives. Conflicts with Native American tribes also escalated. The 1860 Paiute War, fueled by broken treaties and settler expansion, resulted in multiple station attacks. Riders were ambushed, keepers killed, and several stations burned. One notable event was when Pony Bob Haslam rode nearly 190 miles through hostile territory to deliver the mail, despite being injured by arrows. Even though isolation posed a real threat, Pony Express riders completed their routes. These men were alone for hours, accompanied only by their horse, a weapon, and the encroaching darkness. A broken leg, an injured mount, or a missed station could mean dying alone in the wilderness, never to be found, and still they rode. The system persisted. Mail was delayed but rarely lost. Riders were sometimes wounded but usually survived. Over its 18-month run, only a small number of riders lost their lives on the job. The Pony Express wasn't a romantic myth of the Wild West. It was a harsh, often dangerous undertaking. But in enduring these perils, the riders became legends. They proved that even the harshest terrain could be crossed, at least long enough to deliver a letter. Though it operated for just a year and a half, the Pony Express had an immediate and lasting effect on the United States. At a time when the nation was on the brink of civil war, desperate to feel connected across its immense geography, the Express made one thing clear: distance no longer had to determine destiny. Before the Pony Express, it could take weeks for letters to travel from the East Coast to California. Political decisions, business deals, and personal news often arrived too late to be useful. But with the Express, mail reached San Francisco in just 10 days. Suddenly, Californians weren't isolated. Businesses grew more confident. Newspapers published near real-time updates. Families felt closer. Most importantly, the Union felt more unified, an invaluable reassurance as war loomed. Politically, the Express reinforced to the federal government that the West was within reach. It became a symbol of national cohesion during a time of division. President James Buchanan received regular updates from California in the tense months before Lincoln's election, thanks in part to the Express. Economically, it laid the foundation for future infrastructure. The relay stations scattered across remote territory later served as sites for railroads, telegraphs, and stagecoaches. Routes pioneered by the Express were absorbed into permanent communication systems. What began as a risky venture became the model for coast-to-coast connectivity. Culturally, the Pony Express embodied the frontier spirit. Newspapers glorified the riders, turning them into instant icons. Young men across the country dreamed of riding fast through danger with a mail pouch and a mission. Even while it operated, the Express became legendary, capturing the spirit of unity and courage the nation craved. Long after it ended, the Pony Express helped shape the American identity. It represented speed, bravery, sacrifice, and above all possibility. In just 18 months, it accomplished what steamships, Congress, and diplomacy hadn't. It made a divided nation feel like one. The Pony Express didn't just carry mail, it carried the future, one ride at a time. Yet from the beginning, the Pony Express was destined to be short-lived. Its demise wasn't due to failure, but to progress. As fast as a horse could gallop, it couldn't match the speed of the telegraph. Just 2 days after the Express launched in April 1860, work began on the transcontinental telegraph, a coast-to-coast system that could send messages in minutes. Telegraph lines pushed west from Missouri and east from California. Every mile of wire tightened the deadline on the Express. By October 24, 1861, just 18 months after the service began, the final wire was installed. The network went live, and coast-to-coast messages became instantaneous. That very same day, the Pony Express delivered its final letter. The sound of hooves was replaced by the click of Morse code. But even before the telegraph was completed, the Express was already running at a loss. Despite its success in speed and reliability, it was a financial failure. Russell, Majors, and Waddell had invested over $700,000 and saw little return. Without government support and facing high costs, horses, riders, station maintenance, supplies, the model simply wasn't sustainable. It was always meant to prove a point that fast communication was possible across great distances. But the expected mail contract never came through. Russell faced financial scandal, and the company unraveled. By the time the telegraph launched, the Express was already nearing its end. Beloved and heroic, yes, but also completely outdated. Yet its ending wasn't met with bitterness. The Pony Express had done what it set out to do. Riders moved on to other frontier roles. Stations were repurposed or left behind. The country turned toward the future. The fall of the Express wasn't a failure. It was a transition. The horse made way for the wire, just as the wire would eventually give way to radio, satellites, and the internet. But for a brief moment, America watched in awe as teenage riders and strong horses overcame time and distance. In a world obsessed with speed, the Pony Express became legend, leaving behind hoofprints that no telegraph wire could erase. Though it lasted just 18 months, the Pony Express became one of the most iconic and enduring stories of the American West. In truth, it was a risky and short-lived business, but in the public imagination, it became much more. A symbol of bravery, speed, and the resilient frontier spirit. Hollywood films, dime novels, and textbooks turned the Express into legend. The image of a lone rider silhouetted at sunset, charging across the prairie with a mailbag and revolver, became a national emblem. This wasn't just nostalgia. It was part of how America came to define itself. The Pony Express offered a narrative of courage, unity, and endurance. Figures like Pony Bob Haslam and Buffalo Bill Cody became folk heroes. Cody, whether he truly rode for the Express or not, helped cement its myth through his Wild West shows, embedding the image of the fearless teenage courier into global culture. Monuments followed. Statues of riders now stand along the trail from St. Joseph to Sacramento. Highways and bike paths follow the original route. Reenactments, museum exhibits, and historic tours keep the legacy alive. Even the U.S. Postal Service has issued stamps, honoring this brief but significant achievement that helped knit a nation together. But the Pony Express endures for a deeper reason. It reminds us of a time when connecting across distances required risk and communication demanded courage. It shows us that speed once relied not on satellites, but on determination. a willingness to ride through snow, desert, and darkness, with only a horse and a goal. In our era of instant communication, it's easy to forget how hard it once was to stay in touch. The Pony Express remains a tribute to those who bridged vast distances, not with fiber optics, but with muscle and heart. Its legend lives on, not because it lasted, but because for a brief moment it outran the impossible. Beer provided essential calories and nutrients, and became a staple in the diets of laborers, priests, and royalty alike. Workers engaged in constructing temples or digging irrigation canals were often paid in beer, sometimes several liters daily. More than just a drink, beer was a communal ritual. Instead of mugs, people gathered around large ceramic jars, drinking through long, reed straws to strain out sediment. It wasn't merely about intoxication. Beer fostered connection, survival, and reverence for the gods. In many respects, beer helped shape Sumerian identity. It was embedded in ceremonies, legal systems, farming practices, and trade. It was both a necessity and a sacred act. Liquid, civilization that influenced brewing cultures from the Tigris to the Nile. If the Sumerians gave beer its spiritual origin, the Egyptians took it to the next level. During the rise of the Old Kingdom, beer evolved into more than just a ritual item. It became a societal cornerstone. It featured in daily meals, religious ceremonies, and burial practices. Egyptian brewing operated on a massive scale within temple complexes and royal estates, often run by religious institutions. The Egyptians believed beer was a divine gift from Osiris, the god of agriculture and fertility. It was frequently offered in ceremonies to gods like Hathor, goddess of joy, fertility, and intoxication. Though brewing methods were similar to those in Sumer, Egyptian techniques advanced significantly. Bread made from emmer wheat or barley was partially baked, crumbled, and mixed with water. Dates or honey were added to sweeten the mix, which then fermented in ceramic vessels. The resulting brew was thick, unfiltered, and highly nutritious, sometimes consumed with a spoon. Beer wasn't just for the living. Tombs were filled with jars of beer for the afterlife, alongside bread and meat. It was considered vital. No proper journey to the next world was imaginable without it. Ancient records detail recipes for the dead, beer offerings to deities, and images of brewing, all underscoring beer's spiritual importance. Beer also powered Egypt's labor force. Pyramid builders weren't slaves but paid workers, often receiving up to 4 liters of beer per day. This wasn't a luxury. It provided hydration, nutrients, and boosted morale. One archaeologist even dubbed it the ancient Egyptian energy drink. The state maintained strict oversight over beer production and distribution. It was taxed and regulated. Women, particularly priestesses and temple workers, played major roles in brewing, linking beer to both household life and spiritual authority. Beer in Egypt was not a minor detail. It nourished people, honored gods, and filled tombs. Like the Nile, it flowed through every part of society. Across the ancient world, beer was more than a beverage. It was a sacred connection. Its presence was welcome in temples, funerals, and festivals. Fermentation wasn't viewed as science, but as a divine transformation, a sacred process turning grain into holy liquid. Brewing was a spiritual task, and drinking was a form of communion. In Sumer, the goddess Ninkasi personified this link. Her hymn served as both a prayer and a brewing guide. Rituals likely began with invocations to Ninkasi and ended with temple offerings, beer shared among priests or poured out in libation to the gods. In Egypt, this spiritual aspect deepened. Temples brewed their own beer for daily offerings, sometimes dedicating hundreds of jars during festivals. One such celebration, the Festival of Drunkenness, honored the myth of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of wrath, who was pacified by red-colored beer disguised as blood. This act saved humanity, underscoring beer's mythical power to soothe divine rage. Priests and priestesses actively took part in brewing. Religious texts mention specific sacred brews for rituals. In funerary rites, beer was believed to nourish the soul in the afterlife. Tomb inscriptions listed beer offerings, often accompanied by prayers and hymns. Outside the temples, large-scale seasonal festivals involved communal drinking. These events weren't casual. They symbolized connections between humans and the divine. Whether celebrating a harvest, honoring the dead, or marking a solstice, beer helped dissolve the boundary between daily life and the spiritual realm. Even as wine became more prominent in elite rituals among cultures like the Hebrews and Hittites, beer retained its spiritual symbolism. Linked to fertility, the land, and common people, it remained a sacred, grounding force. Drinking beer wasn't just about satisfying thirst, it was about attuning to the rhythms of nature, the gods, and the life-death cycle. In fact, beer may not only have been a result of civilization, it may have sparked it. Some historians suggest the desire to brew beer motivated early humans to begin farming. While grain was grown for bread, there's growing evidence that beer making was also a key driver behind early agriculture. In ancient Mesopotamia, where farming first flourished, barley was valued not just as food, but for its ability to ferment. Once harvested, it could be stored, ground, and used in bread and beer. Unlike often contaminated water, fermented beer was safer and could be stored longer, especially important in arid regions. Brewing required tools, storage, temperature control, and careful timing. This complexity encouraged organized labor, innovation, and even early science. Sumerian clay tablets show a clear understanding of fermentation, allowing consistent results without modern tools. In urban hubs like Uruk and Babylon, breweries were part of the state and temple economy. Beer was issued to workers, soldiers, and officials. Taxes were collected in grain and beer. Because it connected religion and the economy, its production was closely controlled. Brewing thus contributed to record-keeping, bureaucracy, and standardized. Measurements to beer also expanded trade networks. Regions with surplus grain or brewing expertise exchanged beer ingredients and equipment. Archaeologists have found pottery jars of fermented drinks at trade sites across the Levant and Egypt, showing beer was a valuable good. In essence, beer helped humanity settle, organize, and flourish. It supported labor, connected cities, sustained religious life, and gave purpose to agriculture. It was liquid infrastructure, building the ancient world one sip at a time. Before beer became industrialized or its recipes formalized, it was primarily a woman's craft. In many ancient societies, brewing wasn't a male profession. It was a domestic art, handed down through generations of women. Far from being a trivial task, it was sacred and skilled, like a treasured family recipe. In Sumer, beer was closely tied to femininity. The goddess Ninkasi wasn't symbolic. She represented the real-world fact that women, both at home and in temples, led the brewing process. Baking and brewing, both involving fermentation, were often done together. While men managed politics and commerce, women provided the sustenance that kept society running. In Egypt, this tradition continued. Women brewed beer at home using clay jars, grain bread, water, and natural flavorings. It was labor-intensive, but a regular task, done for family needs or local trade. In wealthier homes, female servants operated small-scale breweries. Tomb art and hieroglyphs often depict women brewing, straining, and storing beer, reflecting their importance. Women were also involved. Ancient brewing was not mere guesswork or luck. It was a skilled craft, honed over time. It combined careful observation, trial and error, and environmental awareness. While methods varied by culture, the fundamentals were remarkably consistent. grain, water, fermentation, and time. The real intrigue lay in the variations. Barley was the most common grain used for brewing, though emmer wheat was also popular, especially in Egypt. These grains were selected not just for availability, but for their natural suitability for fermentation, thanks to their sugars and enzymes. Grains were partially malted, soaked and germinated briefly, then ground into mash or baked into special bread loaves for brewing. In both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions, these loaves, known as papa in Sumerian, were crumbled into large clay vats with water. The mixture was stirred, sometimes boiled, then left to ferment. Natural yeasts from the air or brewing vessels started the process. Brewers didn't understand yeast as a microorganism, but they knew some vessels produced better beer, likely because they retained beneficial yeast colonies. To enhance flavor, brewers added ingredients like dates, honey, herbs, or spices. Egyptian. Beer was often thick and sweet, like drinkable porridge. Filtering was optional. Some beer was drunk through straws to avoid sediment, while others were so nutrient-dense they were considered meals, especially for laborers and the poor. Temperature was another important factor. In the hot climates of Egypt and Mesopotamia, brewers carefully timed their work and stored brews in shaded or underground areas to manage fermentation. Some beer was aged in sealed clay jars, while other batches were made for immediate consumption. Brewing. Tools were simple: clay vessels, wooden paddles, woven sieves, and stone hearths. Everything was handmade, and no two batches were exactly the same. Yet brewing knowledge was preserved through oral traditions, songs, and rituals, like the hymn to Ninkasi. Far from primitive, ancient brewing was a sophisticated adaptation to local environments, grain types, and cultural preferences. It represented not just culinary skill, but a deep connection to nature, time, and transformation, a kind of early alchemy. As beer became integral to daily life, its influence extended far beyond households and temples. In many ancient societies, beer served as food, currency, and a vital part of the economy. It played a key role in state operations, from wages to taxes. In Mesopotamia, beer formed part of the ration system. Workers, whether builders, farmers, or scribes, were paid in beer. Quality and quantity depended on one's role. Higher officials got finer beer, while laborers received thicker brews. Thousands of cuneiform tablets document these distributions and transactions, highlighting beer's economic importance on par with silver or grain. As beer production grew, it became a formal trade. Breweries, often linked to temples or estates, required numerous workers: grain collectors, millers, bakers, brewers, and transporters. Some areas became known for their beer, developing unique regional styles and trade routes. While beer wasn't bottled like today, it traveled in ceramic jars sealed with wax or cloth. Traders exchanged it for goods such as olive oil, wool, and pottery. In Egypt, large-scale beer production supported urban centers, rural estates, soldiers, and temples. Breweries were often tied to state granaries, and beer was carefully managed, taxed, and stored. During shortages, it even became a substitute for money. Beer also played a role in long-distance trade. Residue from barley brews has been found as far as Cyprus, the Levant, and Nubia, indicating fermented beverages traveled alongside luxury goods. Although wine would later dominate elite circles, beer remained the drink of the people, present in village markets and religious offerings alike. Its perishable nature made it a local product, but one with far-reaching impact, sustaining not only individuals, but entire systems. Beer production supported a wide range of people: farmers, artisans, merchants, and priests. It was both nourishment and infrastructure. A single mug of beer may have cost only a few coins, but behind it stood a complex web of agriculture, labor, and trade. In ancient times, beer was a common thread, shared by all social classes. But the type of beer varied drastically depending on status. While everyone drank it, not everyone had the same experience. Much like food or clothing, beer mirrored social hierarchies. Among the Sumerians and Akkadians, daily rations of beer were given to workers. These brews were dark, dense, and unfiltered, more of a stew than a beverage, but rich in nutrients and ideal for laborers in hot environments. Still, distinctions existed. Records mention up to 9 types of beer, ranked by quality. Higher grade. Brews were reserved for priests, scribes, and administrators, showing that even beer reinforced class divisions. In Egypt, the contrast was more striking. Commoners drank thick beer made from emmer wheat and flavored with dates. The elite, however, enjoyed filtered, sweeter varieties. Tumart depicts nobles sipping golden beer beneath palm trees, served by attendants with ornate jars. For them, beer was more than sustenance. It was a sensory experience. Pharaohs and nobility received daily beer offerings alongside wine and bread. These weren't just rituals, they were symbols of status. Only the wealthy could afford skilled brewers, high-quality ingredients, and the luxury to enjoy beer as a leisure drink rather than a necessity. Beer also served diplomatic and ceremonial purposes. Offering fine beer at feasts or during negotiations signaled respect and affluence. Failing to do so could even be seen as disrespectful. The profession of brewing also reflected social divides. In households and villages, brewing was often done by women or slaves. But in temples and elite estates, brewing became a specialized profession, with trained and sometimes salaried staff. Temple beer was better regulated and taxed, making it politically significant as well. So while beer was a unifying beverage, its meaning and form varied greatly. For some, it was daily sustenance. For others, it was a mark of power, wealth, or divine favor. Each jar carried more than just flavor. It carried status. Today, millennia after Sumerian priestesses sang to Ninkasi or Egyptian laborers rested. With a brew, the legacy of ancient beer still lingers in our brewing methods, cultural practices, and economic models. Modern brewing owes much to these early innovators. Core practices like malting, fermenting with wild yeast, and adding flavorings were all pioneered without modern tools. Ancient brewers relied on tradition, intuition, and repeated practice, guided by oral lore and spiritual reverence. Their techniques laid the groundwork for the scientific brewing that followed. Cultural echoes remain in places like rural Peru, Ethiopia, and Eastern Europe, where families still brew beer in ceramic vessels using centuries-old methods. In these communities, brewing is more than a task. It's a social ritual, a living link to the past. Beer's symbolic role endures as well. From public festivals to intimate gatherings, beer continues to foster connection, celebration, and identity. Even the casual pub pint shares something with the ancient clay pot passed among friends. Academically, the study of ancient brewing has grown into a field called bioarchaeology. Using residue analysis, researchers have reconstructed and even commercially produced ancient beer recipes. Some brews come directly from Egyptian tombs, offering a literal taste of history. Most importantly, ancient beer reminds us that civilization wasn't built solely on warfare or monuments. It was also built in kitchens and breweries by everyday people. Beer was created by women, consumed by workers, and offered to deities. So the next time you enjoy a glass, remember, it's more than just a drink. It's part of a shared human story, one that spans continents, cultures, and centuries, a tradition still fermenting today.